With over 190 million downloads per month, Joe Rogan is easily the biggest name in podcasts around the world, and he recently inked quite a sizable deal. Some people saying $100 million to have his podcast exclusively on Spotify for the next 3 years, starting in September. What does this mean for podcasters? What does it mean for video content creators? What does it mean for audio content creators? Let's talk about it. Hey, what up? It's your boy MobbJustice back again with another video, and for today we're going to be talking about the world of podcasting, especially because of the deal that Joe Rogan recently signed with Spotify that will see him exclusively going over there and offering his content on that platform. Now, to begin with, we really need to define what are podcasts, because it seems that everyone and their grandmother is starting a podcast nowadays. So I just decided to go online and to seek out some definitions of what a podcast is. And according to the Cambridge Dictionary, a podcast is a broadcast or recorded program that is placed on the internet for anyone who wants to listen to it or to watch it. So that's the definition that I decided to go with after scouring the internet for some time, because it seems that there are a lot of ways that people have defined this. Some people take radio programs, for example, take out ads, repackage them, put them online. Other people, if anyone has ever listened to the New York Times' 1692 podcast, for example, you hear that it was more in documentary form, sort of going through that content. If you watch, let's say, Joe Rogan, right, you'll see that his content is different from that. So what is a podcast really just depends on the person. Some people take short interviews, short inserts or voice clips from people at an event, for example, or some breaking news, and put that online in 1 minute clips, and that's considered a podcast. So in terms of the official definition, that's what we're going to be focusing on, this realm where you have players like Joe Rogan playing in that arena. Now, podcasts really hold a special and dear place in my heart. There are a number of podcasts that I personally listen to, such as Two Broke Twimbos in Zimbabwe, Saturday in the Morning, another great podcast from Zimbabwe, the New York Times' 1692, and then obviously Joe Rogan has actually put out a few interviews that I've personally listened to that I thought were really nice, such as the one with Malcolm Gladwell, for example. And then at the same time, you also have some specialist podcasts such as MKBHD's Waveform podcast. But apart from that, I've personally been involved in the podcast realm because I've been on radio for a number of years, and we've often taken a lot of that content from the shows that I do, and we put them on platforms like iono.fm, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And I also host a podcast for one of the business publications in South Africa. I will link both of those in the description below. Now, podcasts are really quite popular and have risen in popularity over the last few years. They're really great for going through a commute. It's long form content most of the time. It can help you to get through a transit. That's how I got into things. Let's say you're on campus going from lectures, going back to wherever you live. Or for a lot of people, it's a companion when you're going to and from work, you're in traffic, that sort of thing, as a substitute to what people normally listen to in terms of radio or their music. That's really great. And then some people have actually argued that because people have been staying at home as much as they have because of COVID-19, that podcast listening might have taken a bit of a hit, but that remains to be seen when the actual numbers really do come out. Now, the deal itself itself is just a tale of some really, really big numbers. Firstly, some people are suggesting, have reported 100 million. Other people are suggesting 125 to 150 million. And all of these numbers, it's so we're just going to use the base number of 100 million. So it's $100 million over a 3-year period. And what it does mean is that Joe Rogan's podcast will be available exclusively on Spotify and no longer available on the other platforms such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, where it has really grown in popularity to become one of the biggest podcasts in the world. And the other one, Joe Rogan himself actually put out a video explaining how the deal works, and he said that from about September he will be putting out the new episodes exclusively on Spotify only, and then by the end of the year he would have moved most of the catalog to being available only on Spotify. The deal itself actually highlights a couple of things that I think are important. The first one is just how big Joe Rogan has become in the podcasting game. If anyone has looked at some of the statistics, you'll see that on YouTube alone, Joe Rogan has his main channel with over 8.5 million with about 8.5 million subscribers, and then he's got another YouTube channel where he posts very small chunks of his podcast called JRE Clips. The first one is called Powerful JRE, the second one is called JRE Clips, and there he's got about 4.5 million subscribers. So that's already a big audience when you consider him just in the YouTube space. But as we said earlier on, he's available on Apple Podcasts and your Google Podcasts and other such platforms, and he's been making quite a bit of money. By some estimates, they say that he's been making around $30 million annually from his podcast, when you consider the advertising and sponsorships that come through that platform. So for a lot of people, the deal itself with $100 million over 3 years with Spotify makes sense, because he would likely have made the same amount of money over that period, and this upfront payment takes out that particular risk. The other issue that I think it highlights is that podcasting has really become quite popular, especially in recent years. And from Joe Rogan himself, he actually says that they receive about 190 million downloads, I think it's per month, which is absolutely that's a huge number. I just need to go check that. I will write it here, if it's annually or if it's per month. So he's easily one of, if not the biggest podcaster in the world. The other thing that I think it also highlights is the fact that as popular as podcasts have become, the bigger conversation is that people really appreciate longer form unscripted content, which is what Joe Rogan has really been good at. Because a lot of the time in content creation, whether it's for video or audio, people have all of these guidelines that they talk about. No, it can't go over 20 minutes or 30 minutes or else your audience will switch off. This is what people say. But when you look at Joe Rogan, a lot of his interviews go as long as 2.5 hours. I've also seen some videos of his that last for 3 up to even close to 4 hours, just talking about one subject or with one guest, just going at it, right? It literally feels like just a conversation, and he's really good at creating that relaxed environment, perhaps exploring some very controversial topics. For those that follow technology and business, they will know that the Joe Rogan podcast is actually where Elon Musk famously was smoking pot, that infamous incident that happened that landed him in a little bit of trouble. But it's content like that has made Joe Rogan as big as he is, and his podcast as big as it is. Now for Joe Rogan himself, I think the deal was definitely quite worth it. We've done the math already about how he would have likely made the same amount of money in the 3 years, but that he's just sort of taken out the risk, because you now know that for those 3 years you've got your money and it's sorted on that end. But the other thing to highlight is the fact that Joe Rogan, this particular deal, Spotify did not buy Joe Rogan's company. They've simply bought the rights to exclusively have his podcast on their platform. It's a licensing agreement. It means that after 3 years, Joe Rogan will be free to have that content on whatever platform he so deems necessary or chooses to have it on. Because at the end of the day, as he said in his own video, he's not an employee of Spotify going forward, and this is a licensing agreement. Those two factors I think is the biggest thing, because over the last few years Spotify has really been serious and bought out some companies and production houses around podcasts, but this is a licensing agreement. So basically they are hiring out the content for 3 years as a way to help them out on that end. So I think for Joe himself, it was probably a very good deal. Takes a lot of the risk out. You've got your money up front, you don't change the format of the show, and at the same time you have creative control, you maintain the rights to the show, and when the period is done you can shop around, maybe renew the contract with Spotify, or perhaps look to sign other exclusive deals going forward. For Spotify, the deal is probably worth it, especially when you consider what the share price did, especially immediately after that announcement, because in the day or so after the announcement was made, Spotify's share price actually went up and added more than 1 billion. I think by some estimates it added about $5 billion to the company's market cap, because people were recognizing the actual potential of this deal. But share prices tend to be volatile and tend to be fickle sometimes because of what happens in the market sentiment and the like. So over time, the real value will be seen in Spotify's bottom line as it reports its earnings over the quarters, especially after that deal starts. That's the first point. The second issue to think about is that up to this point, Spotify has really gained a lot of traction to become the biggest online music streaming platform in the world. But now it seems that their strategy is to become the biggest audio platform in the world, where they become sort of a one-stop shop for all things audio, so your podcasts or your music and the like. So I think they want to do to podcasts what they've done to music. Plus, at the end of the day, you need to also think about the fact that the goal with all of these different platforms, whether you're talking Twitter, whether you're talking Facebook or Instagram, is that they want to get people to stay on the platform as much as possible, right? And what better way for a listening platform or an audio platform than to have long form content like you have with Joe Rogan, who has videos, as we've just said, videos that last on average 2 hours, right? And people seem to be watching a lot of this content on YouTube, which means that they will likely come over to Spotify. And that brings in the other point as well. By bringing on what is arguably the biggest podcast in the world onto your platform, right, you've automatically become a serious contender in the podcast game, right? Because for a long time the space has been dominated platform wise by Apple Podcasts, because they were one of the first platforms. iOS was one of the first platforms where they actually introduced podcasts as part of their offering in iTunes. They were one of the first to really recognize, but this deal I think highlights the fact that they probably hadn't done enough to grow in the space. Yes, they've been doing a lot of content creation in TV with Apple TV Plus, but I think they had thought they would remain dominant in podcasts because they haven't really invested, at least to the extent that Spotify is doing right now. So for Spotify, it's a good place to be in, because already we talked about the 8 million subscribers on the main channel, the 4 million plus subscribers on the other channel, right, on YouTube, and you've potentially got that audience that's likely to then go over and listen to the podcast on Spotify. At the same time, Spotify recently launched a video feature on their platform for podcasts. So Joe Rogan's podcast, which is viewed by a lot of people, by millions of people, it's then likely that automatically Spotify now has millions of people that will be watching their content, especially based off this one platform alone. In all of this, we also then have to realize that Spotify's revenue is likely going to grow because of this point, especially on their podcasting side. They've been making a lot of investments in terms of podcast houses and some production facilities over the last year or so, and this particular content deal is likely in place to help them become a serious contender. And Spotify makes money from, advertising. If anyone has used the free version of Spotify, I've never seen a platform that makes ads that tell you to pay for their premium service as much as Spotify does. But at the same time, even premium subscribers are subjected to some ads, which means that Spotify already, double dips. They subject you to ads in the free version, and they also do the same on the paid version, albeit at a lower pace probably, but it's still double dipping because on the other side they have your money, but they make money from you because of advertising. So it's likely going to help them to increase their revenues, and they'll likely make back this $100 million that they're likely to have spent on this deal after a very short amount of time. So what does this mean for the content creation industry as a whole? Because I feel like this particular announcement sort of goes beyond just podcasting, because of the multi-platform approach of Joe Rogan already existing in audio form on Apple Podcasts, for example, but at the same time having a video version of his podcast on YouTube with already millions of subscribers. It means you are attacking the industry on both the video side and the audio side, which means you are coming in for Apple Music, you're coming in for Apple Podcasts, you're coming in for YouTube. Content creators in all of these spaces are probably all looking at this deal and now trying to say, okay guys, what is the actual value of my content? What is the value of the millions of subscribers, the millions of views, the millions of watch hours, the millions of listen hours that content creators are bringing onto some of these platforms? So we're likely to see a rise in some content creators actually going out to get agents. Some content creators, especially the ones that have really big audiences, because I can just picture one, for example, is Lou Later, or Lou from Unbox Therapy, right? Because he has a number of different channels. He's arguably one of the biggest tech YouTubers with more than 16 million subscribers on that platform, and he has different formats for his shows. And when you think about the Lou Later platform, for example, it's more podcast, it's more news, it's more tech related, and it makes you wonder if a Spotify, for example, could strike a deal with a player like that to say, listen, you have all of these people, you're talking about tech, people are tuning into, because on Lou Later, for example, it's longer form content, is having wide ranging conversations about what's going on in tech. It's different from what actually got him famous around unboxing products and stuff like that. He's exploring this side, the longer form content, and it's gained a bit of traction. So as Google, are you looking at guys like that and saying, okay, before these guys leave our platform, perhaps we should strike a deal with them? Because one of the things that you have to really think about the Joe Rogan deal again is that he himself has said that his content will still be available on YouTube. Especially, I think that JRE Clips channel is going to be very key and instrumental to driving people from YouTube onto Spotify to listen to the podcast. And for new people on both platforms, it's gonna be a win-win for a person like Joe. So right now, I think the big conversation will be, as a content creator, what is the value of your content? That's the first one. And the second one is, as either a production house or a platform, right? If you're a radio station, if you are a podcast network, if you are a YouTube, if you are Google, which owns YouTube, how does this change things? Because now your content creators are really thinking about what their value is, and if people haven't really been having those conversations, they're likely to have them now. That's the third thing. And then I think the other thing to consider is that it's likely going to result in greater conversations about talent. Yes, we keep talking about content creators and the like, but that's more on that side. But rather, talent in the sense that platforms, are likely gonna have to now start investing more in their talent, or else a platform like a Spotify can come and take your person away because you're likely not doing enough with them or have given them a bigger offer. Because I'm just thinking about the scenario, right? A Spotify goes to Joe Rogan and says, Joe would like to have you on our platform. But chances are the person who negotiated the deal on behalf of Joe and Joe himself, because Joe is likely to have a team in place, agents and the like, they are likely to have gone to a YouTube and said, listen, we have a deal on the table with Spotify, and Spotify is willing to give us $100 million. What are you willing to give us, right? Just as a form of respect, or just from a negotiating point of view, because you sort of go to the people that are going to give you the most, right? And with the way that things are going, I don't think it's any stretch of the imagination that a Google likely looked at the deal and said, perhaps Joe is not worth that $100 million to us right now. But going forward, when you now multiply it across, a number of content creators that have, sizable followings, and then you say, let's say, you have 20 of the biggest creators, and they're now thinking of what their value is and start shopping around about how to take their content onto other platforms. That's when I think it becomes a real conversation. YouTube, for example, makes about $1 billion in advertising revenue per month, just based on 2019 numbers. That's huge money, right? And a lot of it is driven by that creator community. So from a creator point of view, these are new conversations. So if you're a creator, especially if you have some type of a big following, this is an exciting time, because it forces competition, it forces the industry, and it forces creators to relook at these relationships, how people can be making money on platforms like YouTube, like Spotify, like Apple Music and Apple Podcasts. Now, going forward, I think this entire issue with Joe Rogan, with Spotify and the like, this will not be the last exclusivity deal that we're likely to see. Either Spotify might start making similar licensing agreements with other creators. That's the one option. The other option is other platforms like an Apple Podcast or a YouTube might wake up to the fact that their content creators might go to other platforms, and it might wake them up to start signing exclusive deals with content creators that are still on their platforms. That's the second issue. The third issue is in following this money, we are likely to start seeing more appreciation of talent and investment in talent. So people that are on a platform, you identify your stars and you say, how can we help this person to grow their audience so that we can help them to, have more revenue, 1, 2, create more content, and 3, keep them on the platform, because that's the most important thing. You can't have your biggest creators all exiting and going, stage left, right? And then I think at the end of the day, one of the things that I really enjoy about this whole thing is the fact that the podcast that Spotify has chosen to take on is Joe Rogan, specifically because being in the space myself, I've often had some creative differences with the producers and teams, because you're asked to keep things to a certain time, and we have all of these metrics and things like that around what's long, what's short. We need to make sure that audience retention, and I always argue to say that if content is compelling enough, people will be willing to ride with you on that content. And I think Joe Rogan is really a good example of that philosophy, because his conversations are really long. People have trouble watching, let's say, a 20-minute sitcom, for example, or sitting through a 30-minute interview. But Joe Rogan, for his niche audience of people, because you have to always remember, as much as he has millions of people watching and listening to his content, it's still a niche, because there are about 8 billion people on this planet. And even if Joe Rogan is commanding an audience of, let's say, combined 10 million on YouTube, just as an example, right, that is still a small fraction of the world's population as a whole. So it means that in finding his niche, he's been able to find his niche, grow that niche to a point where it is a sizable niche, right? But more than anything else is the fact that that niche appreciates that long form unscripted content. People want authenticity. People want things that are organic. They want to have conversations that really get to the heart of the issues. They want conversations that really explore topics, not sort of glazing over the top, as you find in a lot of mainstream media, where you go for 5 minutes here, then there's an ad, and then there's this feature, and then all of that stuff. People just want to have pure conversations. And I think Joe Rogan has really been testament to the fact that there are a large number of people that don't mind listening to a 2-hour conversation, as long as it's a pure conversation. There's a lot of authenticity, and at the same time it's driven by a big personality like a Joe Rogan, but it's also driven by good content, good topics, and really recognizable guests like an Elon Musk, for example. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of this video. Somewhat on the long side, but I think it's one of those topics that really needs to be explored. As I said, I'm quite passionate about podcasts. You can let us know, you can let me know, what are you listening to? Is this a debate that you were even thinking about? Are you even paying attention to this deal? Do you listen to podcasts? These are all the questions that I'm interested to hear all of your thoughts on. Also, don't forget to subscribe. We're really close to reaching a new milestone in a few days, weeks, and I'm definitely looking forward to that. But as I said, passionate about podcasts, passionate about content creation. Very interested to see how the rest of the industry, on both the video and audio side of things, is going to respond and react. Also interested to see what other deals Spotify is gonna make, because just in the last year alone, they've spent a sizable amount of money, more than the $100 million that we keep talking about on today's episode, because they've bought podcast production houses. They are now licensing content and the like. So it really seems like they are really investing in this space. So it would be good to see where else they are going to be putting their money, and what other platforms are going to do with their money going forward in response to this move. And also content creators, right? What type of conversations is this going to spur in this space, and going forward, what type of demands or deals are content creators on YouTube, on Spotify, maybe even the rising TikTok right now? What are people going to be saying to the platforms? Because if you've been able to grow an audience on one platform, it's very possible that you could take your audience onto another platform, which is the bet that Joe Rogan is making right now. So those are all the things that I'm interested in. But more than anything else, just spotlighting what's going on in the podcasting space, and really putting some good value, right, on the hard work that content creators are making right now in this space. So shout out to Joe Rogan, shout out to Spotify, Apple, Google. We're waiting for you.
Hey, this is Baby G, and you're watching the Mob Justice channel. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Live it, love it, like it. This is the Mob Justice TV.